Agitprop. Agitprop is a portmanteau of agitatsia and propaganda in Russian. And there was in Russia a department of agitation and propaganda was created in the 1920s because Russia was ruled by the Communist Party. Okay, the Soviet Union was ruled by the Communist Party, and of course they focused a lot on propaganda. They focused on spreading their ideology. They focused on making sure that people conform to their belief systems. So they created a department in the government for agitation and propaganda so that their message would be spread to the masses. Okay, the duty of this department was to oversee political education in schools. This happens in China even today. Whatever message is being disseminated in schools is in favor of the Communist Party. It disseminates information about communism. And it was also meant to ensure that the mass media did not propagate any message against the Communist Party. There was a surveillance of mass media, and the department also promoted party propaganda and encouraged people to join the Communist Party. And they just checked the information that was being broadcast by TV and propagated by newspapers to ensure that everything conformed to the communist agenda. Okay, and education had to be communist. Education had to create in the students leaning towards the Communist Party. So Agitprop was a means of propagating the ideology of the party, and it attempted to mobilize people to join the party. Okay, so they used literature and art as a means of inspiring people, as a means of communicating a certain message and encouraging them to join the party. And the common people, if you gave something like Das Capital to the common people, no one would understand. If you talk about dialectics and dialectical materialism to the common person, they won't understand. They are looking at their daily existence, at their food, at their education, at the basic level, shelter, clothing. So the Communist Party had to appeal to the basic things if they wanted to bring the common people to their fold. Theoretical things did not have much value for the common people. So what did they do? They'd organize roadside plays, like street plays, and which propagated the communist ideology. They created books and cartoons and comics and posters. Even today, we see presses that print only communist stories, or stories with a communist twist. So people could access these kind of popular culture, so to say. So they influenced, they promoted these kind of plays and books, and they used a mass media to propagate the message. Okay, and there were trains. Okay, there were trains where there were posters, some posters that propagated the message of communism, and cars where slogans were written. Okay, and there were agitation centers. All these served to propagate communist art. So this was the initial meaning of agitprop. It was used by Soviet Russia to propagate communism, okay, through popular culture, basically. But gradually it came to refer to any kind of highly politicized art. Okay, now it is not just about Soviet Russia, it's also about any art that conveys a political message. Even the graffiti, graffiti that we see sometimes in favor of the government or against the government, graffiti that propagates messages. Okay, so all this come under agitprop. It emerged in Russia and Germany in the 1920s, and it was highly adaptable to outdoor performances. So agitprop literature, it mainly comprised drama, plays, so they could be performed outside because they had to attract the farmers, the laborers, and those who were working outside the homes. Okay, so it had to appeal to people who belong to the lower classes. Okay, so it had to appeal to people working on the streets. It had to appeal to people working in the factories. Okay, so these were performed outside. Okay, and it depicted absolute good and absolute evil. Okay, so there was no midway in agitprop. Okay, so the bourgeois were bad, the communists were good. This was the idea propagated by the agitprop in Russia. Okay, so in order to attract the masses. And they also used ridicule and sarcasm as a means of criticizing their rivals. Okay, and the audience, of course, was unruly. There were people who were working. They maybe took out 5 minutes from the factory to see this play. Okay, so the plays had to be kept very short, and it should. They also had to have this emotive power, to create some emotions in the audience, okay, to appeal to their sensibilities. So that is it about the sixth section. Now, apart from these six schools that we discussed, and we also have the theater of cruelty, we have confessional poetry, spiralism, new wave science fiction, dub poetry. So some of it will be dealt with by the next resource person, and after that, when I come again for the next session, I'll deal with things like spiralism and new wave science fiction. So postmodernism definitely has left an impact on the contemporary age, as is evidenced by, like I said, there is contemporary Indian theatre. It draws on elements from the theatre of the absurd. Okay, and you can also see how we refuse to accept absolute truths and absolute value systems, where we in project in thesis, in PhD thesis, we always tell our students not to use words like fact or truth, because there's no fact, there is no truth, everything is subjective. So from normal magazine writing to highly academic writing, to plays, to art, we can see the influence of postmodernism even today. So that is why the question arises as to whether postmodernism has ended or if it is still continuing. Okay, so there are huge debates, and people are talking about the postmodern age, people are talking about transmodernism, people are talking about metamodernism, people are talking about digimodernism, where in digimodernism, for instance, it was propounded by the theorist Alan Turing. He talked about how digital media has come to influence art and literature. Okay, so he talks about how digitalization has led to a certain kind of decline in human values. Okay, so how there is an influx of mobiles, computers, internet of things on everything. Okay, so it talks about digimodernism and postmodern age, where there is extreme importance accorded to transnational connections, okay, and again digital media. So all these we will discuss at the end, after the postmodern age 3. So just we need to remember that there are alter modernities, there are this postmodern age, transmodernism, and various other terms which are given to the era after postmodernism. But the remarkable thing is none of this have found acceptance in the academia. They are just talking about this, but it is mostly old wine in new bottles. So it has failed to receive much kind of an attention from the academia. So still we are confused as to whether postmodernism is still there, or it is still continuing, or it has ceased to exist. So probably after the next 2 sessions, you will get an answer to these questions. And so that is it about today's lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Minu. We savored your lecture today, enjoyed every part of it. And it goes without saying that a lot of effort has been put into preparing these lectures, refining it, retuning it. And thank you very much. And may I ask the participants to please put forward your question. You can directly ask the question, raise your hand. I can unmute you and you can directly ask the question. If there is any question, because this is an age where there should be few questions that are expected. Although Dr. Minu has very, in a layman's language, he has tried to explain through various examples. Every detail was shared. There's no doubt about it. But if you have to ask any question, you can raise your hand and I will just ask you to ask the question to our resource person directly. In the meanwhile, we have a question by Krishna Agarwal, and she asks that, is there any concrete poetry by any Indian author?
Not that I know of. Concrete poetry by Indian authors. I don't know of any, but there might be. Maybe we can just check right now.
Next question is by Ghanisht Verma. You can directly unmute yourself and ask the question, Ghanisht. Ghanishta Verma.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Am
Good
I
evening.
audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Ma'am, can we
Yes.
say that modernism realized that while bathing a baby in a bathtub, the water gets dirty, and postmodernism simply threw water and baby outside the window? And if it is so,
I can't really hear you. Could you repeat your question?
yes, ma'am.
Hmm.
Am I audible now?
Yes, yes, yes.
Ma'am, can we say that modernism realized that while bathing a baby in a bathtub, the water gets dirty? And postmodernism realized that because the water gets dirty, therefore it threw out the water and the baby outside the window. So, ma'am, can we say that postmodernism was a move, not basically a movement, but it is something that, along with lot many good things, it brought with itself lot many things which was not good for society. And was there any
Yes.
reaction against postmodernism?
See, that is right, because postmodernism has been criticized for this very thing, okay, where it promotes certain thoughts that lead to a lack of ethics, like I said before. If I say I have my own rights and wrongs and I kill someone, okay, and I say this is my right, okay, then there's a problem there, right? Then there's a question of ethics there, okay. So it was a continuation of an rupture from modernism, but postmodernism carries with it the revolution, the possibility of dismantling itself, okay. Mm, there are two things. First thing is the question of ethics, like I mentioned before, and the second is that postmodernism deconstructs itself. So postmodernism says there's no center, but postmodernism itself becomes a center, or centerlessness itself becomes a center around which this entire thing revolves, okay. So postmodernism is neither a very coherent philosophy, nor is it an absolutely, see, first thing, there is nothing good and bad, you can't term anything good or bad, just that postmodernism brings with it its own questions of ethics and moral dilemmas, because it subscribes to views that might not be always acceptable. Say, for instance, religious leaders, they would never accept most of the tenets of postmodernism, okay, because it says that value systems are subjective. Okay, so murder, for instance, or maybe a violent act, for instance, can it be considered ethical? Yeah. So yes, it has both positive sides and negative sides, but then we cannot really judge. Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, to the previous question, I have an answer, and thank you for pointing it out. Actually, in Sanskrit, we have Chitra Kavyas. There was a question as to whether there is concrete poetry in India. Yes, it is there. We have Chitra Kavyas in Sanskrit, and it's also these are written in the form of maybe bows and arrows, clubs. So there are poems that look like elephants, okay, and a horse moving, okay. So these two, yes, there is pattern poetry in India, and it is known as Chitra Kavya in Sanskrit. It's basically found in Sanskrit. Yeah.
May I ask now Lauren Azad to please put forward your question? Yes, Lauren.
Good evening, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And sir, just to point it out, I'm sorry, but the pronunciation of my name is Lauren.
Okay.
It goes like Lauren.
Yeah, actually, proper noun we can have our
Yeah,
own
I know.
pronunciations,
I
but
know,
I'll take it
sir.
as Lauren. Yes, Lauren.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good evening, ma'am. First of all, thank you so much for this very fascinating lecture. Actually, I'm very much captivated by your lecture. One of the reasons being that I love 20th century like anything when it comes to literature. So, ma'am, I want to ask that one of the topics which you discussed today is that of existentialism. So, as you discussed that meaninglessness, nothingness, and absurdity, all this could be taken as characteristics of existentialism. That one point which always confuses me in this topic is that existentialism talks about absurdity, which you find in theater of the absurd and everywhere. In any way can we say that apart from trying to depict that absurdity which is found in that particular age, it is also trying to depict the any search for a meaning, or is it just about depicting that absurdity? Is it in search of a meaning, means for that existence?
Yes, it's very much about a search for meaning as well. This absurdity itself arises from the lack of meaning, and the lack of meaning, a lack always implies a possibility of a presence, of a search for a presence, right? So here there is an absence of meaning, and existentialism also says that meaning is about your choices. So the human being is constantly trying to make sense of his or her existence through the search for meaning. For instance, in the chairs, okay, I'll illustrate it with an example. In the chairs, the man is very disappointed with his life, and they're talking rubbish, like we don't see the connection between the things they talk about. But the one thing that is crystal clear is that he wants to convey a message to the world. He wants to convey a message through a messenger. So ultimately he conveys his message to the messenger, and then the messenger turns out to be deaf and dumb. By then this person is dead. Okay, so this message is a symbolic meaning to life. Okay, so probably this is in a symbolic or metaphorical fashion. This message itself is the meaning of existence. So maybe he wanted to convey that, and it is impossible for the messenger to convey it. It is impossible for the reader to grasp it. So even if there is a meaning, it is beyond our reach. It is not always accessible. So yes, the search for meaning is inherent in any analysis of existentialism. Yes.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And ma'am,
Yeah.
adding to it, I just want to ask that among all those poetry which were written in postmodern age, if we talk about the concrete poetry or the Black Mountain poetry and so on, just to confirm once that what was their approach? Was it objective or was it subjective? And the reason behind it?
Oh, of course, they all dealt with it in a subjective fashion, See, for instance, the Black Arts movement, okay? So it was very much rooted in Black subjectivity, in Black experience, even not just in Black experience, even in the through the experience of the individual. Now, when you come to confessional poetry, which is also a part of the postmodernity, you will understand that everything is subjective. There is nothing that is given in an objective fashion. But this is not just a feature of postmodernism. It existed earlier also, because if you look at Wordsworth's poems also, it is also about his way of interpreting things. Yes, that is there. But postmodernism just gave it a term and emphasized it. Okay, so all these movements, whether it is a Black Arts movement or concrete poetry, it is also about the poet's way of perceiving things. Jazz poetry, okay, all these are extremely subjective. Literature is fundamentally subjective. Postmodernism just highlighted this kind of subjectivity. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Looking forward to hear you again. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Lauren. Next, may I ask Sudham Das to put forward your question? Sudham, over to you.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
Ma'am, thank you very much for made this very complicated part of English literature to me. My question is, sir, am I audible clearly?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes.
Ma'am, my question is, in this postmodern literature journey, we can go through Black Mountain poets, Black Arts movement. So can we ask that this journey is about Blacks or Afro-Africans? It is governed by or lead by these Blacks or Africa. Can we say this?
You are saying that whether these movements are centered on Africa? Are you talking about whether these movements, or are you talking about why Africa assumed that much of prominence in postmodernism?
Actually, ma'am, Black mountain poets, Black art
Uh-huh.
movement,
Uh.
these blacks are regularly coming into this journey.
All right. Okay. See, postmodernism emerged during the 20th century, and it was around that period itself that Black emancipatory movement gained prominence. Okay, let it be the Harlem Renaissance or the Second Harlem Renaissance. All these gained prominence at around the same time. Okay, during the postmodern period. That is why this Black arts movement and jazz poetry, all these come frequently in this discussion. But there's also another thing. Postmodernism talked about the displacement of the center. Okay, displacement of those in power. Okay, so till now the African American community was marginalized. So postmodernism played a role in bringing marginalized communities to the forefront. And if you look at it, a lot of emancipatory movements happened during this period. The independence movement in South Asian countries or in Africa, and the Harlem Renaissance, where the Black African Americans were fighting for their rights, feminist movements. Okay, all these were very popular during this time because there was a dismantling of the center. There was a dismantling of what was considered powerful. Till then, the West was considered powerful. The whites were considered powerful. Men were considered powerful. Postmodernism advocated a dismantling of these hierarchies and a dismantling of the center. And a lot of movements, emancipatory movements, subaltern studies, feminist movements, all these arose during this period. So as a community that is consistently being marginalized in the US, the African Americans got an opportunity to articulate themselves because of these ideals that were being propagated. Okay, so that is why the Black African American poets and movements like jazz poetry, all these feature very constantly in postmodernism. But it is not just the African community. We chose these topics, but there are also things like confessional poetry which occurred in India. There's also the post-colonial movement which emerged as a byproduct of postmodernism in some ways. So just that it's about, we chose these areas, but fundamentally any emancipatory movement comes as an aftermath of postmodernism.
Okay,
Thank you. May I now ask Shivani Sharma to please put forward your question. Over to you, Shivani.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
Thank you so much, because a very pertinent period from the perspective of NET and other competitive exams, and very immaculately presented. Actually, you have more or less answered my question, but what I wanted to ask was, you initiated your lecture by talking about how this entire period, so to speak, was subverting of hierarchies and systems, questioning of authority, dismantling the center, and how the marginalized were trying to gain their voice. So, if I may, resistance must have been a very important theme, so to speak, in all of these activities and even works of literature, ma'am. So was there a strong sense of turbulence and unrest as well throughout the period? Because we are talking about questioning the monopoly that has so long existed, so to speak. So could you maybe elaborate on that a bit? The turbulence and
Yes.
the unrest.
Yes, there was a strong sense of political unrest. You must remember that it happened during the period immediately following the Second World War. So when modernism emerged after the First World War, there was this sense of fragmentation and trouble and alienation. So after the Second World War, this was more reinforced, okay, because science proved to be totally useless in preventing a war and maintaining peace. So people were obviously, disturbed. There was a lot of political turmoil. There was the Algerian War of Independence happening at this time. So there was this revolution against French colonialism in Algeria. And there were a number of emancipatory movements happening in Africa. Okay, so it was, if you look at India, 1947 was a period when we got independence. There was a huge resistance to colonial rule. So all over the world, this kind of resistance could be seen. Resistance to authority, resistance to hierarchies. Okay, so as such, the postmodern period was informed by the political unrest and disturbance and resistance. Okay, so that is what we see here also. That is why a lot of emancipatory movements arose, and there was an increased consciousness among the people, maybe because of the propagation of Marxism, maybe because of the propagation, maybe because of the extreme suppression that people underwent. Okay, so there was a consciousness in the people's minds also that they need independence, that they need a voice of their own, that they need to articulate themselves. Okay, so this kind of unrest among communities, yes, it played a major role in the establishment and even emergence of postmodernism. Yes, that played a major role, and that explains why a lot of postmodern literature comes from colonial countries, colonized countries. It comes from African countries. It comes from women. Okay, to take confessional poetry, for instance. So it comes from a movement. The movement called spiralism is rooted in Haiti. Okay, so all these contribute, all these arose as a result of the inner turbulence in the minds of the common people and in the society at large. Yes, Shivani, I hope I have answered your question, Shivani.
Yeah, rightly. Shivani, you can, do you want to ask anything else? I think she has answered your question.
Yes, sir, absolutely. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Fine, thank you. We take the last question of the day by Ognimitra Roy, and Ognimitra's question is, the US is limiting what can be taught about gender studies in the schools, and also at places it's making mandatory to learn Christian values and scripture. US is not a communist country, but it is also essentially doing the work of Department of Agitation and Propaganda. Your views on it?
All right, Agni Roy, I was wondering, what is the US limiting about gender studies? Could you just tell me that? Because I feel that there's gender studies is assuming a lot of prominence in not just in US, in Western countries as well as in other countries. But what exactly are they kind of limiting in terms? Like, could you be more specific about that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Yes,
Please go ahead.
And basically, they are trying to even ban the word homosexual from their lexicon to some extent. They cannot even use the word. They cannot even have some kind of tableaus there. They cannot even have art there. So these things, they're categorically erasing these things from the schools. And it is starting, just started for some time now, but it is more prominent nowadays.
All right, perhaps you are talking about some specific institutions. Probably you're talking about missionary institutions, maybe. Is there, are you specifically referring to certain types of institutions, or are you, I don't think, you can generalize that. Perhaps in certain schools or in certain institutions, yes, they are making it mandatory to learn Christian values and scripture. And they might also be emphasizing on not using the word sex, or for instance, or going beyond that as well. Okay, so I feel that countries are increasingly trying to expand gender studies and be more open about talking about things like sexuality. Even missionary institutions are making attempts at doing that. But then and mandatory to learn Christian values and scripture, yes, there are missionary institutions which insist on that. But for that matter, any kind of institution would subscribe to their own values. All right, so yes, gender, the question of sexuality, gender, all these they might not get the parlance they deserve in, say, schools run by certain communities, okay, whether it be in India or abroad or wherever. And yes, it is also kind of agitation, agitprop, you wouldn't say agitprop because agitprop specifically refers to popular culture, but yes, it's also kind of a way of kind of promoting propaganda. But in some contexts, for instance, if you take the case of India, there is also this provision to one of the fundamental rights is to propagate your own religion, or propagate your own belief systems. So probably missionary institutions subscribe to their value systems, whether it be Christianity or Hinduism or Islam or whatever. So it is fundamentally it's about a right. And gender studies in schools, personally what I felt from my observation of the syllabus in Western colleges and schools is that they are talking more about equality, and rather than about rather than limiting it, limiting that kind of discussion. We should not generalize. Perhaps there are some institutions like that, but there are also institutions which on the whole I feel that gender is being much discussed, and there are schools which ensure that boys also engage in work, this kind of art things, culinary skills, they develop culinary skills, cleaning skills and all that. So yeah, if this kind of thing is also a propaganda, yes, I would say it is propaganda. But it's a complicated question because it is intertwined with the question of religious rights. It's intertwined with the question of belief systems and all that. And we can't say something is right or wrong because we are discussing postmodernism.
Right. So with that, we come to engaging session on postmodernism part 1. And of course, there'll be some other sessions tomorrow and thereafter, where the discussions will continue, and it will get into more more in-depth understanding of the various schools and thoughts. So on behalf of Team DAATH Voyage, thank you, Dr. Minu. Always a pleasure to have you. And thank you all the participants. I'm sure you had a very, very good lecture today and a good experience. And as Lauren rightly pointed out, that these lecture series are set keeping in mind the various competitive examinations. So these are very pertinent areas where there will be questions that will be asked, and what the better way to be answered and taught by the veterans who themselves have qualified these exams. So thank you, Dr. Minu. See you soon again.
Thank you.
Tomorrow. Thank you so much. Take care. Good night.
Thank you very much. Yeah.